The stench of iron and sweat hangs heavy in the air. Beneath the marble arches of the arena, the roar of thousands swells like a storm, drowning out the prayers of men who know they will not leave alive. Sand, once pale, is already darkened with blood, sticky beneath the sandals of guards dragging prisoners toward the light. You can almost feel their trembling, their breaths shallow and frantic as the gates creak open, and the sun exposes them to the hungry eyes of Rome. This was not sport, it was ritual, a theatre of death staged before citizens and emperors alike, where suffering was both punishment and performance. The crowd demanded not merely victory, but spectacle flesh torn, bones broken, mercy denied. Here, cruelty was not the shame of the state. It was its weapon, sharpened for all to see. Were these acts entertainment or executions dressed as games? Rome's arenas blurred that line until death itself became the script. And what began with ritual offerings would soon descend into something far darker, each spectacle more grotesque than the last. The blood spilled here was only the beginning. The Forum Boreum smelled of smoke and sacrifice. In 264 BC, on a day meant for mourning, the citizens of Rome gathered not only to grieve but to watch. The funeral of Junius Brutus Pera should have been solemn, a ritual farewell to an honoured statesman. Instead, 3 pairs of slaves were forced to fight until blood quenched the sand. This was no accident of grief. It was duty. The Romans believed the dead required blood to honour their passing, that spilled life could ease their journey into the afterworld. At first, these combats carried the weight of sacrifice. Each clash of blade against blade was not meant to amuse, but to appease the spirits. Death in the arena was an offering, a currency paid to secure the favour of the gods. Families who staged such rites did so out of tradition and honour. The fight was not for the living audience, but for the one who lay silent upon the pyre. Yet even in those earliest games, a dangerous transformation was beginning. The blood rites of Campania and the martial traditions of the Samnites bled into Rome's own customs. The duel no longer resembled a simple funeral gesture. It became theatre. The spectators began to cheer, to hunger for the clash of steel, to revel in the artistry of violence. Where once the focus was the dead, now the living felt the thrill. By the late Republic, the Senate recognized what power lay in this new form of ritual. Funerals for the elite became public gatherings, each one more elaborate than the last. Families competed with one another in scale, bringing forth greater numbers of fighters to impress the crowd. Mourning gave way to rivalry. Sorrow gave way to entertainment. The spilling of blood was still framed as piety, but in truth, it was fast becoming politics. It was not long before these games no longer required a funeral at all. Magistrates and generals, seeking to display their wealth and curry favour with the people, sponsored gladiatorial contests simply to win attention. The sacred veil of ritual had been cast aside. Death had been untethered from mourning and turned into spectacle in its own right. The crowd was eager to follow. They filled wooden amphitheatres with their voices, shouting for blood, gasping at skill, laughing at slaughter. What began as a duty to the dead had been transformed into a gift for the masses, a theatre where Rome could see its ideals of bravery, endurance, and cruelty performed before its very eyes. And the state, always watchful, understood the potential. If death could enthrall, it could also control. The games were no longer about easing a soul into the afterlife. They were about shaping the living, about teaching Rome's citizens what power looked like. In the sand, they saw discipline rewarded and weakness punished. They saw the authority of the Senate and, later, the emperors, displayed not through speeches, but through blood. What had begun as a ritual offering had become a weapon of influence. The first combat at the funeral of Junius Brutus Pera was remembered not for its solemn duty, but for the precedent it set. Once death was staged publicly, it could always be staged again and larger, always larger. The logic of Rome was escalation, and once the crowd had tasted the spectacle of blood, nothing would ever satisfy them but more. And if men could be made to fight for ritual and spectacle, then beasts could be unleashed as well. The iron gate screeches open, and the crowd falls silent. Dust swirls in the shaft of light cutting across the arena floor. From the shadows lumbers a lion, ribs jutting beneath its golden hide, hunger burning in its eyes. Across the sand stands a prisoner, shackled and trembling, clutching a dull spear he has never been trained to use. The lion lowers its head, lips curling back to reveal teeth yellowed and sharp. The man takes one faltering step back. The crowd leans forward, breathless. Death has been unleashed. This was the Venatio, the hunt. At first, it was staged as a test of courage, where skilled hunters and trained gladiators known as bestiarii faced down wild beasts imported from the far corners of Rome's empire. Bears from the Alps, leopards from North Africa, elephants dragged in chains across the sea all paraded into the amphitheatres as proof of Rome's reach. To slay such animals was to declare dominion, not only over men but over nature itself. Yet Rome was never satisfied with display alone. Soon, the Venatio blurred with another, more sinister tradition, the damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation of criminals, traitors and slaves to be executed by wild animals. This was no duel. It was slaughter, a one-sided spectacle where a man was not expected to fight but to die. The state did not simply execute. It staged executions with savage artistry, feeding human bodies to starved predators while tens of thousands cheered. Political leaders recognized the power of this spectacle. In 55 BC, Pompey the Great staged games that featured 600 lions torn loose into the arena. The sight was overwhelming, hundreds of beasts, dozens of victims, and a crowd intoxicated by the scale of it all. These were not mere entertainments. They were statements of wealth, dominance, and Rome's inexhaustible ability to command death in all its forms. The bones confirm the stories. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons bearing deep puncture wounds, gnawed bones marked by the teeth of lions and leopards. In mosaics preserved from villas, we still see the images of bestiarii bracing their spears as great cats leap toward them, the moment of collision frozen in stone. These were Rome's trophies, proof that the empire could tame and weaponize even nature itself. But the cruelty was deliberate. Animals were starved before release, driven to frenzy by whips and fire. Men were stripped naked to heighten their humiliation. Sometimes condemned criminals were dressed in ridiculous costumes to amuse the crowd as they were mauled, transforming death into both terror and mockery. The line between execution and performance vanished in the sand. Imagine the sound, the roar of beasts, the shrieks of the dying, the thunder of thousands of voices chanting for more. The amphitheatre became a world where nature itself seemed inverted predators, pitted against humans not in survival but in theatre, their savagery orchestrated for applause. Here, Rome declared that even the wildest forces of the earth could be summoned and expended at the empire's command. The lion steps forward. The prisoner stumbles, spear slipping from his grasp. The crowd surges to its feet as predator meets prey. There is no suspense in the outcome, only the anticipation of how long it will take. The sand drinks deep, and the arena echoes with triumph. But if beasts could be made into weapons, Rome wondered, what else could be turned into spectacle? The answer would not be found on land at all. It would rise from the water. The crowd gasps as water surges into the arena, cascading through hidden channels until the sand disappears beneath rippling waves. Wooden planks bob against the marble walls, and the smell of wet earth mixes with pitch from tarred ships. Then, as trumpets blare, oars rise in unison, and two fleets of warships slide forward beneath the Roman Sunday. This is no play acted upon a stage. This is a naval battle, and every man rowing, every man holding a blade, knows he may not live to see nightfall. Rome called them naumachiae, mock sea battles, yet there was nothing mock about them. Julius Caesar first astonished the people by staging one upon an artificial lake near the Tiber. He filled it with real ships, manned with thousands of captives forced to reenact wars long past. The crowd sat spellbound as triremes collided, and warriors clashed across wet, slippery decks. When the battle ended, the lake was not littered with painted props but with floating corpses. Augustus magnified the vision. He carved an immense basin into the Campus Martius, wide enough to host dozens of ships. To flood it, he built an aqueduct solely for the purpose, bending water itself to his will. On its surface, convicts and prisoners of war fought as proxies for the empire's triumphs. Their deaths, both a warning and a celebration. Tens of thousands crowded the banks, gazing upon a sea Rome had conjured from stone. But even this grandeur was not enough. Claudius sought to eclipse them all. He ordered Lake Fucine itself, high in the Apennine Mountains, to be drained and used as a stage. Upon its vast waters, 19,000 condemned men fought to the death while the emperor watched from a throne. Before the carnage began, they saluted him with words that have echoed through history. Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, Those who are about to die salute you. It was not tradition but terror, a phrase born of desperation, seared forever into Rome's memory. The engineering alone was staggering. Channels carved through hills, hidden sluices to control the flood, even mechanisms to drain the waters when the spectacle ended. What was once an amphitheatre of stone could be transformed into an ocean at command. The logistics of war supply, strategy, survival were reduced to entertainment. In orchestrating water and death alike, the emperors declared themselves masters not only of empire but of nature itself. For the spectators, it was breathtaking. Imagine the clash of rams splintering hulls, the shriek of men thrown into churning waters, the spray of salt against your face as a trireme capsized beneath the weight of flames. You could smell the smoke of burning pitch, hear the crack of timbers, see the bodies sinking below the waves. Every sense was assaulted, every moment designed to overwhelm. Yet beneath the oar lay cruelty sharpened to a blade. These were not sailors or soldiers defending their homes. They were prisoners, slaves, and condemned men, forced to reenact wars they never chose. Their courage was meaningless, their victories hollow, for even the last survivor would often be executed once the crowd dispersed. The Naumachia was no celebration of naval skill. It was a declaration that Rome could summon oceans, command death, and waste human lives in a single gesture of power. And still, Rome was not done. It was not enough to drown men in artificial seas. The next act would take cruelty to the stage of myth itself, forcing mortals to play roles the gods themselves had once suffered. The arena quiets, and a man steps into the light dressed as Orpheus. A lyre hangs at his side, his robe shimmering with borrowed dignity. For a moment, the illusion holds until the trapdoor grinds open. From below emerges a bear, starved and furious. The musician raises his hands, pleading, but no song can charm this beast. The crowd erupts as claws slash through flesh. Orpheus does not enchant. He dies, torn apart as the myth is inverted into mockery. This was the cruelty of Rome's mythological executions, where condemned men were forced to embody the legends they grew up hearing. It was not enough for the state to kill. Death itself had to be transformed into performance, grotesque theatre where myths once sacred were restaged as torture. Consider Daedalus, the cunning craftsman of Crete. In Rome's version, he was hoisted aloft on wings of wax and feathers, raised above the arena for the crowd's marvel. But there was no escape, only humiliation. As the mechanisms failed, the condemned plummeted into waiting beasts, his flight ending not in triumph but in agony. The myth of invention became a parody of futility. Even darker was the fate of Pasiphae, who in legend bore the Minotaur after coupling with a bull. Rome reenacted this obscenity by forcing a woman, often a slave, condemned to death into a wooden contraption shaped like a cow. Then, before the crowd's jeers, a bull was driven forward to gore her. What had once been whispered myth became a spectacle of violence, staged for laughter and shock. These were not isolated acts. They became common elements of Rome's festivals, where myth and punishment intertwined. Criminals, deserters, and traitors were cast in these roles not for justice but for theatre. The audience knew the story, and they knew its ending. The only suspense lay in how horrifically it would be delivered. Some victims met their fate in the tunica molesta, the troublesome tunic soaked in pitch and set aflame. Imagine a man dressed as Scaevola, the hero who thrust his hand into fire to prove his loyalty, now consumed entirely in roaring flames. Or another forced to play Hercules, dying in burning agony instead of godlike triumph. The myths of endurance became parables of pain, rewritten in fire and screams. These executions blurred every boundary. Religion became parody, justice became entertainment, and myth itself became a weapon of the state. The crowd watched heroes fall not as inspiration but as spectacle, their deaths an assurance that Rome controlled not only life but story. The empire could take the most sacred legends and twist them until they served its appetite for blood. Archaeological traces confirm the scale. Mosaics depict figures in theatrical costumes facing beasts, while accounts from writers like Martial describe condemned men reenacting myths with grotesque fidelity. The sand of the amphitheatre became a stage, the victims unwilling actors, their scripts written in blood. Imagine being there. The smell of burning pitch, the screams rising with the smoke, the laughter of thousands echoing off marble walls. It was theatre without redemption, art without meaning, myth without hope. Rome had discovered that the cruelest stories were the ones where every audience member knew the ending, yet craved to watch it unfold again. But even these twisted myths were only a prelude. The next evolution of terror would come not from beasts or stories, but from machines, engines of wood, iron, and fire designed to turn death itself into calculated spectacle. The silence before the spectacle is deceptive. The arena looks empty, the sand smooth and undisturbed. Then, with a thunderous crack, the ground itself splits open. A trapdoor swings wide, and from the darkness beneath emerges a wild beast, driven upward by hidden lifts. The crowd roars, marveling not just at the creature but at the stagecraft that conjured it. Rome had learned to engineer death as if it were theatre, using machines not to preserve life but to amplify terror. The amphitheatre was more than stone and sand. Beneath its floor stretched a labyrinth of corridors, pulleys and elevators powered by the sweat of slaves. From these hidden spaces, condemned men could be thrust into the arena without warning. Animals released at the exact moment a victim faltered. Surprise itself became a weapon. One moment the ground seemed solid, the next it betrayed those standing upon it, opening beneath their feet to swallow them whole. Spectacle demanded scale, and Rome responded with invention. Platforms rotated to bring new scenes into view. Collapsible stages buckled on command, hurling men into pits or releasing cages of predators timed for maximum shock. Fire contraptions belched smoke, casting victims in flames that seemed divine in origin. Every device was calibrated not to kill swiftly but to prolong the dread, to ensure the audience gasped before they cheered. These mechanisms blurred the boundary between execution and performance. A man sentenced to death did not simply die, he was made to vanish through hidden doors, reappear in elaborate sets, or face death against a backdrop of engineered wonder. Technology was no longer a tool for survival. It was a prop in Rome's theatre of cruelty. Writers of the time marvelled at this ingenuity. Martial described trapdoors releasing entire tableaux, as if the earth itself had given birth to new spectacles. Seneca, less admiring, condemned the bloodlust disguised as invention, lamenting that human suffering had been turned into entertainment by mechanical marvels. Yet for the emperors, these contraptions were statements of power. To command such machines was to command not only death but the very stage upon which it was displayed. Imagine sitting in the crowd, feeling the vibrations of wooden gears grinding below your feet, the sudden rush of air as a platform collapses, the shrieks of men realizing too late that the ground itself was their executioner. You would not only see death, you would feel it, staged as a revelation that the empire could control even the hidden mechanisms of the earth. It was not engineering for progress, it was engineering for fear. Each contrivance was a reminder that the state could devise new ways to humiliate, terrify, and annihilate at will. The machines did not simply kill, they transformed death into a moment of awe, a carefully scripted performance where every scream, every collapse, every eruption of fire was choreographed to satisfy the crowd. And yet, even as these devices inspired shock, Rome's appetite grew stranger still. The emperors began to understand that cruelty could take forms beyond terror, that the theatre of death could twist into comedy itself. The next act was not designed to horrify, but to make the crowd laugh, turning human suffering into the cruelest punchline of all. The arena stank of sweat and blood, yet the crowd was laughing. At the centre of the sand stood a man dressed in ridiculous costume, his head adorned with a mock crown, his body painted to resemble a god. He stumbled, slipping on the sticky ground, while clowns jeered and mimicked his terror. The condemned was about to die, yet Rome had twisted the moment into a farce. Here, cruelty was not just horror, it was comedy. These grotesque performances blurred the line between tragedy and satire. Condemned men were costumed as mythic figures, mock kings, or comic fools. Instead of solemn execution, they were made the butt of a joke, humiliated before they were slaughtered. One might be dressed as a hapless god, only to be mauled by animals. Another might be forced into a parody of a wedding before being killed by his bride, the scene staged for laughter. Death itself was bent into slapstick, a theatre of agony mocked by mirth. For the crowd, the juxtaposition heightened the thrill. To laugh at the condemned was to confirm Rome's superiority, to treat suffering as entertainment so absurd that it erased empathy. Jesters capered around dying men, mocking their cries as if they were punchlines. Executioners performed like actors, exaggerating every blow for comic effect. The amphitheatre became not merely a place of fear, but of ridicule, where the state demonstrated it could turn even agony into amusement. Some emperors encouraged this dark humour. Suetonius describes Nero staging grotesque theatrics where condemned men were forced to act out parodies of famous plays, their real deaths providing the final act. Martial's epigrams reveal audiences laughing at spectacles where criminals dressed as mythological figures were dispatched in absurd ways. Achilles dying clumsily, Hercules blundering into traps, gods reduced to fools. It was theatre as mockery, designed to belittle as much as to destroy. The effect was devastating for the condemned. To die in the arena was already terror enough. To die as a spectacle of ridicule stripped away dignity, making the victim both entertainment and lesson. The message was clear. Rome did not merely hold the power of life and death. It held the power to decide how a man would be remembered. Even his final breath could be twisted into a joke. His pain transformed into laughter that echoed long after his body was gone. Imagine the sound, the shrieks of the dying drowned beneath peals of laughter. The clash of cymbals and slapstick instruments punctuating screams. Picture the sight of clowns tumbling across the sand while a man burned alive in the tunica molesta, his agony reduced to grotesque theatre. The horror was doubled by absurdity. What should have been solemn was transformed into mockery, as if Rome itself mocked the very idea of mercy. By turning cruelty into comedy, Rome revealed its deepest truth. The arena was not only about punishment, nor even about entertainment. It was about domination, the complete erasure of humanity in those who stood condemned. To laugh at their deaths was to affirm that their lives meant nothing, that the empire's power was absolute. But in the final act, Rome's games would show their true face. Beneath all the laughter, all the horror, all the awe, the arena was always about control. In the blood-soaked sand, power itself was written for every citizen to see. The sand of the arena has long since turned to dust, yet its echoes remain. For centuries, Romans gathered to watch men, beasts, and machines turn death into entertainment. What began as ritual sacrifice at a funeral became a vast system of spectacles that blurred grief, politics, and cruelty into one. Each act, whether beast hunts, flooded oceans, mythological executions, or comic deaths, was not just a display of brutality. It was a message. Rome declared that it held dominion not only over life and death, but over meaning itself. The amphitheatre was the empire's mirror. To its citizens, it reflected the grandeur of conquest, the scale of wealth, the reach of engineering. To its enemies, it reflected terror. Every gladiator's fall, every criminal fed to beasts, every man burned alive in parody of myth was proof that Rome's power was inescapable. The games were theatre, but their true script was control. The state taught its people to cheer at cruelty, to laugh at suffering, to find beauty in destruction. In doing so, it trained them to accept that Rome's authority was absolute. Philosophers saw the danger. Seneca warned that those who watched too long grew numb, their humanity eroded by the constant sight of suffering. Yet emperors knew this numbness was useful. A citizen accustomed to cheering death was a citizen accustomed to obedience. The games did not merely distract, they conditioned. Fear and fascination worked together, binding the crowd to the hand that fed them blood. Were these spectacles entertainment, or were they instruments of rule disguised as pleasure? The answer lies somewhere in between. The people craved them, yet the state weaponized them. The amphitheatre became a pulpit where Rome preached the creed of domination, every drop of blood a verse in its sermon. Imagine the final silence after the crowd dispersed. The torches guttering out, the sand clotted with blood, the bodies dragged into darkness. In that emptiness lies the truth. The arena was never about the victims. It was about the audience, about a society willing to feast on cruelty and call it culture. Centuries later, the stones of the Colosseum still stand, hollow and broken, yet they whisper of the power once performed within them. Rome's arenas remind us that when spectacle is built on suffering, it is never just entertainment. It is control, sharpened into ritual, staged as theatre, written in blood. So the question lingers for us, just as it did for them. When cruelty becomes laughter, when death becomes spectacle, has a society gone too far, or has it only revealed what it truly is?